The Forgotten Asylum. The rain poured heavily as Michael Carter drove down the deserted road leading to Blackwood Asylum. His wipers struggled to keep up with the downpour, and the headlights barely pierced the thick fog surrounding the massive structure ahead. He had read about the asylum's dark history, stories of cruel experiments, inhumane treatments, and patients who had disappeared without a trace. Blackwood had been abandoned for over 30 years, yet it remained intact, as if waiting for someone to return. Michael wasn't just anyone. He was an investigative journalist, and his latest assignment was to uncover the truth behind the asylum's closure. Official reports claimed a gas leak had forced the facility to shut down in 1989, but the whispers of former staff and patients hinted at something far worse. As he pulled up to the rusted gate, he noticed a sign barely visible through the overgrowth. "No trespassing. Violators will be prosecuted." He smirked. He had broken into worse places for a story. Michael grabbed his camera, flashlight, and notebook before pushing the gate open. It let out a loud, agonized creak that echoed through the silent night. He hesitated for just a moment, then stepped onto the overgrown pathway leading to the asylum's entrance. As he approached, he noticed something strange. One of the windows on the third floor was faintly illuminated. His breath hitched. Blackwood was supposed to be abandoned, yet someone or something was inside. Michael hesitated before entering. He glanced back at his car, wondering if he should turn around. But no, this was why he had come. He couldn't back out now. Pushing open the heavy wooden doors, he stepped inside. The air was thick with dust and decay, the scent of mold invading his nostrils. The lobby was vast, with a collapsed chandelier in the center and old furniture draped in sheets. The wallpaper peeled, and the floor creaked under his boots. He lifted his flashlight, sweeping the beam across the room. His breath caught when he saw it. A single wheelchair stood in the middle of the hallway. It faced him as if waiting. Michael swallowed hard and took a step forward. The moment his foot touched the ground, the wheelchair moved. Just an inch, but enough to make his heart pound. Something wasn't right here, and he was no longer alone. Michael steadied his breathing and stepped closer to the wheelchair. It stood motionless now, as if whatever force had moved it had vanished. He shook his head, convincing himself it was just his nerves. Raising his camera, he snapped a few photos of the decayed lobby. The flash illuminated the space in harsh bursts, revealing old nurses' stations, broken chairs, and shattered glass. Then he heard it, a whisper, faint, indistinct. Michael froze, holding his breath. The sound drifted through the air, weaving between the shadows. It wasn't just the wind, it was a voice. "Help me!" His stomach turned to ice. The voice was distant but desperate, coming from deeper inside the asylum. Michael's grip tightened on his flashlight. He had expected silence, an abandoned building with nothing but echoes of the past. But this was something else. For a brief moment, he considered turning back. But then he remembered why he was here. If someone needed help, if there was any truth to the rumors, he had to know. He stepped forward. The whispering stopped. Silence swallowed the asylum whole. And then footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the hallway ahead. Michael's blood ran cold. He wasn't alone. Michael's heart pounded as he aimed his flashlight down the corridor. The beam wavered slightly. Whether from his shaking hands or the thick atmosphere, he wasn't sure. The hallway stretched into darkness, lined with rusted gurneys and broken doors. Some rooms were sealed shut, their locks rusted over. Others were open, revealing empty beds with leather straps still fastened. He moved forward cautiously, each step echoing too loudly in the silence. The air grew colder, and with it came the unmistakable scent of antiseptic and something foul, like old, rotting flesh. A sudden sound made him whirl around. A door at the end of the hallway had creaked open. Michael's grip tightened on his flashlight as he approached. His mind screamed at him to leave, but his body moved forward on instinct. He reached the doorway and hesitated before peering inside. The room was small, with peeling green walls and a single metal bed. A set of restraints lay open on the mattress. But what sent a shiver down his spine was the message scratched into the wall above the bed. "Don't listen to them." His pulse quickened. Who wrote that? And who were they? As he turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind him, and the whispers returned. Michael lunged at the door, gripping the rusted handle with both hands. He twisted and pulled, but it wouldn't budge. His breathing quickened as the whispers in the room grew louder, circling him like a storm. "Help me! Don't let them take me! They're coming!" Michael spun around, his flashlight flickering. Shadows danced along the peeling walls, stretching unnaturally. His pulse pounded in his ears. Then footsteps, slow, measured, growing closer. He pressed himself against the door, his chest rising and falling in panicked gasps. The air in the room thickened, pressing against him like an invisible weight. His flashlight flickered again, then went out. Darkness swallowed him whole. A cold breath caressed the back of his neck. Something was in the room with him. Michael's fingers fumbled with the flashlight, slapping it in desperation. The moment it flickered back on, he aimed it at the center of the room. His stomach dropped. A figure stood in the corner, tall, gaunt, dressed in a filthy, blood-stained straitjacket. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle. The skin stretched tight over its skull. Black, hollow eyes stared at Michael, unblinking. Then it moved, not by walking. It twitched forward, its body jerking in unnatural, puppet-like motions. Michael scrambled backward, his back slamming against the door. His breath hitched in his throat. The figure's mouth opened, but the voice that came out was layered, like multiple people speaking at once. "You shouldn't be here." Michael reached for the door handle again. The figure took another step. "You'll never leave." A violent wind blasted through the room, knocking Michael off his feet. His flashlight flew from his hands, spinning wildly across the floor. Darkness returned, and in the pitch-black void, the whispers screamed. Michael clawed at the door, his fingers scraping against splintered wood. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. The whispers surged around him, growing louder, angrier. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the noise stopped. Silence. A single metallic click echoed through the room. The door was unlocked. Michael didn't hesitate. He grabbed the handle, yanked it open, and stumbled into the hallway. His flashlight lay a few feet away. He snatched it up, flicking it on, and spun around to check the room. It was empty. No figure, no whispers, no message on the wall. Had it all been in his head? His breath came in ragged gasps as he backed away. He needed to get out now, but as he turned to run, he stopped cold. The hallway had changed. The once decayed walls were pristine, the peeling paint now smooth, the broken furniture gone. The flickering lights overhead were bright and functional. And from the distance came the sound of screaming patients and buzzing electroshock machines. Michael's stomach twisted. He wasn't in the abandoned asylum anymore. Somehow, someway, he had been pulled into the past. And Blackwood Asylum was alive again. Michael's breath hitched as the sounds of the asylum swelled around him. The fluorescent lights hummed, and the scent of antiseptic burned his nostrils. He stumbled backward, his mind reeling. This wasn't possible. He had entered a decayed, abandoned building, but now it was alive. Doctors in white coats rushed past him, their expressions cold and detached. Orderlies dragged screaming patients down the halls. The distant buzz of an electroshock machine sent chills down his spine. Michael pressed himself against the wall, gripping his flashlight like a lifeline. But no one seemed to notice him. Was he a ghost here, or had he truly been pulled into the past? Then, a voice called out, "You're not supposed to be here." Michael turned. A nurse stood a few feet away. Her uniform was pristine, but her face was pale, her eyes dark hollows. He opened his mouth to speak, but she suddenly reached for him, her fingers elongating unnaturally. "Leave now." Michael barely had time to react before the walls around him shuddered, as if the asylum itself was breathing. And then the world fractured. When Michael's vision cleared, he was sitting in a chair. His wrists and ankles were strapped down. His pulse spiked as he struggled, but the restraints held firm. The room around him was dim, lined with bookshelves filled with medical journals and patient files. A massive wooden desk stood in front of him, and behind it sat a man, dressed in a dark suit and round glasses. The man studied Michael with unsettling intensity. "You shouldn't be here," the doctor said, his voice eerily calm. Michael swallowed hard. Where am I?" The doctor smiled. "You are in my asylum." Michael's blood turned to ice. Blackwood Asylum. But not the abandoned ruin he had entered. This was the asylum before it was shut down, and somehow he was trapped inside. Michael yanked at his restraints. "Let me go. I'm not supposed to be here." The doctor ignored him, flipping through a file. "Michael Carter, investigative journalist, likes to chase the unknown. But sometimes, Mr. Carter, the unknown chases you." Michael's breath hitched. The doctor leaned closer. "You wanted the truth about Blackwood, didn't you?" Michael nodded slowly. The doctor smiled. "Then let me show you." He pressed a button on his desk. The door behind him creaked open. 2 orderlies stepped inside, pushing a gurney with a body covered in a sheet. Michael's stomach twisted as the sheet was pulled away. He saw himself, pale, motionless, eyes open but empty. His own dead body lay before him. Michael's mind shattered. He screamed, and the asylum swallowed him whole. Michael awoke in a cell, a small white room, padded walls, no door, no windows. His clothes were gone, replaced by a hospital gown. His arms were bound in a straitjacket. Panic surged through him as he tried to move, but the restraints held tight. Then, from the far corner of the room, a voice whispered, "You were never supposed to leave." Michael turned, his pulse hammering. A figure sat in the shadows. As it leaned forward, the dim light revealed his own face, twisted in a deranged grin. Michael's doppelganger tilted its head. "You were always a patient here, Michael." Michael's vision blurred. His mind spiraled. No, this wasn't real. Couldn't be real. But as the whispers in the walls returned, laughing, mocking, he realized the truth. He had never been an outsider. He had always been a patient, and Blackwood Asylum would never let him go. The echoes of Ashford Asylum. There are places in this world that carry with them a dark history, forgotten by time, but never fully erased from the minds of those who dare to enter. One such place is Ashford Asylum, a sprawling complex tucked away in the hills of rural America. The stone walls, once pristine and grand, now stood weathered and cracked, a haunting reminder of the horrors that took place within. Ashford was once a place of hope, a sanctuary for the mentally ill, but as the years passed, it became something far worse. The patients, some broken by trauma, others by the weight of their own minds, were subjected to treatments that pushed the boundaries of ethics and humanity. The asylum was a place where suffering was a daily routine, and death lingered in the corners like an old friend. The asylum had been abandoned for years when Claire Harrison first heard about it. She was an investigative journalist, known for seeking out the most chilling stories, the ones that no one else dared to touch. When she stumbled across a faded newspaper clipping about the asylum, her curiosity was piqued. The story claimed that the asylum was haunted by the spirits of its former patients, trapped in a never-ending cycle of torment. Claire didn't believe in ghosts, but she was fascinated by the idea of uncovering the truth behind the rumors. With her camera and notebook in hand, she set out to visit Ashford Asylum. The journey to the asylum was long and winding. The road seemed to narrow as she neared the building, the trees growing thicker, their branches intertwining like twisted fingers reaching for the sky. As Claire finally approached the asylum, she was struck by the eerie silence that surrounded it. There were no birds singing, no rustling leaves. It was as if the world itself had abandoned this place. Stepping onto the property, she felt an odd chill run down her spine. The once grand entrance now stood like an old, forgotten sentinel. Its wooden doors long since rotted away, the iron gates rusted and bent. She pushed the gate open with a creak that echoed in the stillness, her heart pounding with a mix of excitement and fear. Inside, the asylum was a labyrinth of decaying rooms and long, empty hallways. The air was thick with the smell of mold and old wood, and every step Claire took seemed to stir the dust of forgotten years. It was as if time itself had stopped here, trapped in the endless cycle of decay. As she explored the building, Claire began to feel the weight of the place. It was more than just the physical decay. It was something deeper, something unsettling that seemed to hang in the air. She could hear whispers, faint and indistinct, coming from the walls. Sometimes, when she turned a corner, she thought she saw figures moving just out of the corner of her eye, but when she looked directly at them, they vanished. It didn't take long for Claire to realize that Ashford Asylum was not just a building. It was a tomb filled with the restless spirits of those who had been forgotten by society. As the night wore on, she found herself growing increasingly uneasy. The sounds became louder, the whispers more distinct. And then, in the dead of night, something happened that would change everything. As the moonlight poured in through the cracked windows, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls, Claire felt a strange sense of dread settle in her chest. The whispers were no longer distant. They were closer now, as though they were all around her, coming from the very walls of the asylum itself. She stood still for a moment, straining her ears to catch any coherent sound. But all she could hear was a soft, unintelligible murmur that made her skin crawl. Trying to shake off the unease, Claire continued to walk down the hallway. The air grew colder, and the temperature seemed to drop with every step she took. A sudden chill ran through her body, and for a fleeting moment, she thought she saw a shadow dart across the hallway in front of her. She froze, her heart racing, but when she looked again, the corridor was empty. There was something deeply unsettling about Ashford Asylum, something that went beyond the abandoned building itself. It was as if the walls held the memories of the patients who had once walked these halls, their pain and torment still echoing through the structure. Claire could feel it, seeping into her very bones, a presence that was both oppressive and ancient. She reached the end of the corridor and opened a door into what appeared to be a patient's room. The walls were lined with peeling wallpaper, and the floor was covered in a thick layer of dust. It seemed untouched by time, as though the room had been abandoned in the middle of a moment. There was a bed in the center, the sheets long since tattered and stained, and a single chair by the window. But it was the walls that drew her attention. On the wall opposite the bed, faint, scratched marks ran from top to bottom. Strange, jagged lines that looked almost like a person had tried to claw their way out. At first, Claire thought it was simply the result of years of neglect, but as she stepped closer, the marks seemed to shift in the dim light. It was as though the scratches were still being made, as though they were constantly in motion. Claire took out her camera and began to snap pictures, her hand trembling slightly. The sound of the camera's shutter echoed in the quiet room, amplifying the eerie atmosphere. As she took another photo, she noticed something in the corner of the room. A shadow, a figure, was standing just out of her line of sight. Claire's heart skipped a beat. She slowly turned around, her breath hitching in her throat. There, standing by the door, was a man. His clothes were ragged, his face pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through her very soul. His hands hung limply at his sides, his posture hunched, as though he was waiting. The room grew colder still. Claire's instincts screamed at her to run, but she was rooted to the spot. The man didn't move. He simply stood there, staring at her with an empty, lifeless gaze. She could feel the weight of his presence, an oppressive force that seemed to drain the life from her very being. For a moment, time seemed to stretch and bend. Claire's mind raced, but her body refused to obey. The whispers grew louder, now coming from every direction, filling her head with maddening voices. She could hear the man's breath, slow, labored, though his mouth did not move. "Leave this place," a voice, raspy and broken, whispered from the darkness. "You don't belong here." Claire's heart pounded in her chest. She felt a cold sweat break out on her skin as she backed away from the figure. The room seemed to close in on her, the walls pressing in as if to trap her. The air was thick, suffocating. Her eyes darted to the door, but it felt miles away. And then the figure moved. In a flash, the man lunged forward, his eyes burning with an unnatural fire. Claire screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the overwhelming silence that followed. She turned and ran, her footsteps echoing off the walls as she fled down the corridor, her breath ragged in her chest. The asylum seemed to stretch on endlessly, twisting and turning in ways that defied logic. No matter how fast Claire ran, she couldn't escape the feeling that something was following her, just out of sight, but always close. The whispers were now deafening, filling her ears with a maddening chorus of voices. She reached what she thought was the main exit, but when she tried the door, it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through her. She pushed against the door with all her strength, but it remained locked, as though the asylum itself refused to let her leave. Desperate, Claire turned and ran down another hallway, the shadows stretching long in front of her. As she ran, she passed by an old, rusted door with a faded sign above it. Isolation ward. Something pulled her toward it, a force beyond her control. She hesitated for only a moment before she yanked the door open. Inside, the air was thick with a foul stench, and the walls were lined with old, decaying furniture. In the center of the room stood a single figure, a woman, her back to Claire. She was hunched over, her long hair hanging in tangled strands around her face. As Claire stepped into the room, the woman slowly turned around, revealing a face that was twisted in agony. Her eyes were wide with terror, her mouth open in a silent scream. The woman reached out to Claire, her hands shaking as if begging for help. But before Claire could move, the woman vanished into thin air. The door slammed shut behind her, and Claire was plunged into darkness. Claire's breath caught in her throat as the darkness enveloped her. The sudden silence was deafening, and for a moment, she thought she might be losing her mind. She strained her eyes, trying to see through the blackness, but the room was pitch black, the air thick with the oppressive weight of the unknown. She reached out, her hands trembling, hoping to find something, anything to ground her in reality. Her fingers brushed against the cold, damp walls of the isolation ward, and she shuddered. The whispers returned, this time louder than before, circling around her like a swarm of angry bees. Their words were indistinguishable, a mix of pleading and laughter, each voice overlapping with the next until it became a maddening cacophony that threatened to crush her sanity. Claire stumbled forward, her mind racing, trying to make sense of everything. Why was she here? Why had she come to this cursed place? The questions gnawed at her, but there was no time for answers. Her heart raced in her chest, her pulse pounding in her ears. Every instinct screamed at her to escape, but the door she had entered through was now gone, replaced by an impenetrable wall of black, and then a light. At first, it was a flicker in the distance, barely perceptible, but as it grew stronger, Claire realized it was coming from a doorway at the far end of the room. It was a dim, yellowish light, like the glow of a lantern, but there was something wrong about it. The air around the light shimmered, distorting everything around it, and the whispers grew louder, as if they were beckoning her toward it. Against her better judgment, Claire moved toward the light, her steps slow and hesitant. The room seemed to stretch out endlessly as she walked, the walls closing in around her as she neared the source of the eerie glow. The whispers became clearer, now unmistakably pleading. "Don't go in there. Turn back. You're not ready." Claire paused, her hand reaching for the doorframe, her body frozen in place. There was a force behind the words, something desperate, something that felt as though it was trying to protect her from whatever lay beyond. But the temptation to uncover the truth was too great. With a deep breath, Claire stepped through the doorway. The world around her shifted. She was no longer in the isolation ward. The room she found herself in was different, sterile, clinical, and suffocating in its stillness. The walls were lined with old metal bed frames, some broken, others rusted beyond repair. The floor was covered in cracked tiles, stained yellow with age. The faint hum of fluorescent lights filled the air, their buzz unsettling in the otherwise silent room. But it was the patients that caught Claire's attention. They were all there, dozens of them, sitting motionless in their beds, their eyes wide open but unseeing. Their bodies were thin and frail, their faces gaunt and hollow. They wore tattered hospital gowns, their hands gripping the bed rails with unnatural strength. The air was thick with their presence, as if they were all frozen in time, caught in some eternal nightmare. Claire's heart skipped a beat as her gaze landed on the man she had seen earlier. He was sitting in the farthest corner of the room, his face as pale and lifeless as before, his hollow eyes fixed on her. But this time his lips were moving. "Help us?" he whispered, his voice a rasping, broken sound that sent chills down Claire's spine. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the room, making Claire jump. She turned to see one of the patients thrashing in his bed, his eyes wide with panic. He screamed, his voice hoarse and desperate, but no sound escaped his mouth. His body writhed as though he were trapped in some invisible force, his arms flailing in a futile attempt to escape the restraints that held him down. And then, one by one, the other patients began to stir. Their eyes, once lifeless, now burned with an intense hunger, as if they were coming back to life in some twisted, unholy resurrection. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, as though they were being controlled by something beyond their own will. The whispers returned, louder now, drowning out everything else. Claire's mind felt as though it was splitting apart, the voices in her head clamoring for attention, each one more frantic than the last. "Leave, before it's too late. They're not real. None of this is real. Get out. They'll take you too." But it was too late. The patients were no longer simply moving, they were coming for her. Their hands reached out, fingers curling into claws as they lunged toward her. The room seemed to close in on Claire, the walls shifting and distorting, the floor cracking beneath her feet. The light from the doorway flickered and died, plunging her into darkness once more. She turned to flee, but the room had changed. The hallway that had once led to the door was now a maze of narrow passages and broken doors. The whispers had turned into screams, a cacophony of tortured souls crying out for release. Claire's legs felt weak beneath her as she ran, her heart pounding in her chest. But no matter how fast she moved, the walls seemed to close in tighter. Suddenly, a cold hand wrapped around her ankle, pulling her down. She screamed, but the sound was lost in the overwhelming noise of the asylum. The darkness swallowed her whole, and just before she lost consciousness, she heard one final whisper. "You should have never come back." Claire awoke with a start, her body rigid, her heart racing in her chest. The darkness around her was suffocating, thick and oppressive, but it wasn't the same as before. The air felt different, fresher, but colder. She slowly opened her eyes, blinking to adjust to the faint, flickering light that hovered in the distance. The last thing she remembered was being pulled into the darkness, her body yanked down by an unseen force. But now, she was lying on the cold, hard ground, her head throbbing with a dull ache. Her surroundings were unfamiliar, and for a moment, she thought she might still be trapped in some twisted nightmare. The walls around her were cracked and decaying, covered in layers of grime, but they looked older, ancient, almost as if they had been here far longer than Ashford Asylum itself. Claire sat up slowly, her hands brushing against the stone floor, the chill creeping up her spine. She glanced around, the flickering light coming from a small window far above her, barely visible through the layers of dirt and dust. It cast an eerie glow, illuminating the room in sickly hues of yellow and green. Her surroundings resembled an old, abandoned cellar, with jagged stone walls and a low ceiling that seemed to press in on her. There was no sign of the patients, no trace of the nightmare she had just witnessed. But something wasn't right. The silence was too still, too perfect. And as Claire listened, her ears began to pick up a soft, rhythmic sound. Something faint, but constant. It sounded like breathing. Her body tensed, and she stood up, her legs unsteady beneath her as she took cautious steps toward the source of the sound. The floor creaked underfoot, the old wood groaning in protest, but she didn't stop. Each step felt as though she was walking deeper into some dark pit, and the air grew colder with every movement. She turned a corner and froze. There, standing in the middle of the room, was the woman, the same one she had seen earlier. Her twisted, agonized face burned into Claire's memory. The woman was not looking at her. Instead, she was staring at the wall, her back hunched, her hands pressed against her head as if she were trying to block out the voices. "Please, no more." Her voice was faint, barely a whisper, but it sent chills down Claire's spine. The woman's body trembled, her eyes wide with terror, yet there was no escape in her gaze. It was as though she were trapped in a cycle, unable to break free from whatever horrors still lingered in this forsaken place. Claire opened her mouth to speak, to offer comfort or at least try to understand what was happening, but her voice failed her. The woman didn't seem to notice her presence at all. She continued to mutter to herself, rocking back and forth in a slow, torturous rhythm. Suddenly, a sharp, grating noise filled the room, a screeching sound like metal scraping against stone. Claire spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. The door at the far end of the room was opening, slowly, painfully, as if some unseen force was trying to free it from its ancient rusted hinges. The room was filled with a low, vibrating hum, like the building itself was alive. The light from the small window flickered violently, casting long, trembling shadows on the walls, making everything appear to shift and pulse. Claire's body surged with adrenaline as the door finally creaked open. Beyond it was a long, narrow corridor, darker than anything she had seen so far. And in that darkness, something moved. A shape, a figure emerged from the shadows. At first, Claire thought it was another patient, another spirit trapped in the asylum's grip. But as the figure stepped into the faint light, she realized it was something else entirely. It was a man, his face gaunt and pale, his eyes sunken in their sockets, his mouth hanging open in a silent scream. His body was twisted, bent at unnatural angles, as though he had been contorted by something far worse than simple physical agony. His limbs were too long, too thin, and his skin was stretched taut over his bones. He was dressed in the same tattered hospital gown that Claire had seen the patients wear, but his presence felt different. He wasn't a ghost. He was something worse. The man let out a low growl, his gaze fixed on Claire. He began to shuffle toward her, his movements jerky and disjointed, as though his body was no longer entirely under his control. The air around him seemed to thrum with an unnatural energy, the walls vibrating, the ground beneath her feet shaking. "Get out of here," the man rasped, his voice breaking and echoing in the silence. "They will take you." Claire's heart slammed against her ribs, and for a moment, she thought she might faint. But before she could move, the woman in the corner suddenly screamed, a blood-curdling, primal sound that shattered the silence. She turned toward Claire, her eyes wide with frantic fear. "Run!" the woman screamed. "Run now!" The man moved faster now, his unnatural speed and jerking motions sending terror through Claire's veins. His mouth opened wider, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. A low, guttural growl rumbled from deep within his throat. Without thinking, Claire turned and bolted down the corridor, her footsteps pounding against the ground. She didn't know where she was going, or if there was even a way out of this nightmare. All she knew was that she had to escape, had to get away from the thing chasing her. The corridor stretched endlessly, twisting and turning in a maddening spiral. The walls seemed to close in on her, narrowing with each step, and the air grew thick with the stench of decay. The whispers returned, louder now, their voices rising in a chorus of anger and despair. Claire's breath came in ragged gasps, but she couldn't stop, couldn't slow down. The man was gaining on her. Just as she thought she couldn't run any longer, she saw it. A faint light at the end of the hall. A doorway. She pushed herself harder, her legs screaming in protest, her lungs burning with each desperate breath. The light flickered, casting eerie shadows that stretched like fingers, as if trying to pull her back into the darkness. She was almost there. But then, just as she reached the doorway, the floor gave way beneath her. The ground crumbled, sending Claire plummeting into the black void below. Claire screamed as she fell, her body weightless in the dark, the ground vanishing from beneath her feet. She felt the air rush past her, cold and suffocating, and the sounds of her own frantic breaths mixed with the distant echoes of the whispers that seemed to follow her, no matter how far she fell. The fall felt endless. Time stretched, bending and twisting as if it had no meaning in this forsaken place. Then, with a sharp, jolting impact, Claire's body crashed against something hard. Her world went black. When she opened her eyes again, the world around her was different. The ground beneath her felt solid, though it was cold and damp, and the air smelled of mildew and decay. She groaned, pushing herself up onto her hands and knees, her body aching from the fall. She had no idea where she was, but one thing was certain. This place was worse than anything she had encountered so far. The room was dark, the walls close and oppressive, lined with rusted metal bars that seemed to stretch endlessly upward, disappearing into the shadows above. She was in a cage, a large iron-wrought cage, sitting in the middle of a long, narrow cell. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dirt and grime, the walls jagged and rough. The only light came from a faint, flickering bulb overhead, casting a sickly yellow glow over the surroundings. Claire's heart raced in her chest as she struggled to her feet, panic flooding her mind. She was trapped. There was no way out, no exit in sight. She ran her hands across the bars of the cage, her fingers brushing against the cold metal. The walls around her seemed to close in tighter, suffocating her with the weight of the place. Every instinct in her screamed to escape, to find a way out, but the darkness seemed to have swallowed all hope. The whispers returned. This time they were louder, sharper, and they weren't just whispers anymore. They were voices, clear and distinct, speaking in a language Claire didn't understand, but somehow it didn't matter. The meaning was clear. They wanted her to stay. The cage door creaked open, the sound echoing through the narrow, hollow space. Claire froze, her blood running cold. A figure appeared in the doorway, a man tall and thin, his face obscured by the shadows. His clothes were old, worn, stained with something dark, and his eyes were obscured behind a veil of dark hair. Claire took a step back, her breath quickening. The figure stepped forward, his movements slow, deliberate, as if savoring her fear. He said nothing, but his eyes, those dark, empty eyes, stared directly at her, piercing through her very soul. "Please," Claire whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please don't." The man didn't respond. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a rusted, old key, a key that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. Claire watched, paralyzed, as he moved toward her, the key dangling from his outstretched hand. He stopped just outside the bars of the cage. The room seemed to grow colder, the shadows deepening around them. Claire tried to move, to scream, but her body was frozen. It was as if the air itself had thickened around her, choking off any attempt at escape. The man raised the key, his eyes never leaving hers. With a slow, deliberate motion, he reached through the bars and unlocked the cage door. The door swung open with a horrible, metallic screech. Claire felt a cold shiver run down her spine, her heart pounding as she realized what was happening. The man wasn't just unlocking the cage. He was releasing something far worse than the asylum itself. Suddenly, she could hear the sounds, the scuttling, the scraping of something large moving in the shadows beyond the cage. It was coming closer. With a scream, Claire threw herself at the door, desperate to escape, but her legs gave way beneath her. She fell to the ground, her body too weak to fight. Her eyes were glued to the shadows, where something dark and terrible was emerging, something that had been waiting for her. The whispers grew louder, a shrill, deafening chorus that filled the room. But the only thing Claire could focus on was the figure emerging from the darkness. It was tall, twisted, its limbs unnaturally long and jagged, its face covered by a mask of skin that looked as though it had been stitched together from the flesh of other beings. Its eyes were hollow, dark voids that stared at Claire with a hunger that sent ice through her veins. The thing took a step toward her, its movements fluid and predatory, like a creature of the night stalking its prey. Claire's pulse raced as she struggled to move, but her body was paralyzed by fear. She could hear its breath, slow, deliberate, each exhale filling the room with a low, wet sound. And then the thing spoke. "Welcome to your final torment," it rasped, its voice a mixture of growls and whispers. "This is where you belong now." Before she could scream, the thing lunged, its fingers stretching toward her like claws ready to tear through her flesh. Claire's body reacted before her mind could catch up. In a desperate burst of adrenaline, she pushed herself backward, scrambling across the dirt-covered floor, her fingers scraping against the rough stone walls as she tried to put as much distance between herself and the thing that was closing in on her. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her heart thudding painfully against her ribcage as the creature loomed over her. But there was nowhere to run. The room was too small, the walls too close, and the thing's presence was suffocating. It didn't need to chase her. It was already everywhere. The stench of decay and blood clung to the air, and the shadows seemed to stretch and twist in unnatural ways, as if the darkness itself was alive and eager to consume her. The thing stepped forward, its elongated limbs swaying with a disturbing fluidity. Its face, a grotesque, stitched mask of flesh, twitched as though it could sense Claire's every movement. The hollow voids where its eyes should have been seemed to glow faintly, as if some dark energy pulsed within its very being. Claire's vision blurred as she struggled to control her breathing. She had to escape. There had to be a way out of this nightmare. But as the creature moved closer, its growls and rasping breaths filling the air, her mind seemed to falter, caught in the grip of an overwhelming, paralyzing fear. It was as though her own thoughts were turning against her, like the asylum was pulling her back into its depths, erasing her will to survive. The man, the one who had unlocked the cage, stood silently in the doorway, watching, his eyes empty of any expression. It was as if he were waiting for something, enjoying Claire's terror as the thing advanced. But Claire wasn't ready to give in yet. She refused to be its prey. With a final surge of determination, Claire's hand shot out and grabbed a jagged piece of broken stone from the floor. She didn't think about the pain or the blood that seeped from her palm as she gripped it tightly. There was no time for hesitation. She had no choice but to fight. The creature was just inches away now, its breath hot and fetid against her skin. It leaned forward, its mouth opening wide, revealing rows of sharp, yellowed teeth. But Claire swung the stone with all her strength, aiming for its face. The impact sent a sickening crack through the air as the stone collided with its mask. The creature let out a low, guttural roar, its head snapping back in pain. For a moment, Claire thought she had done it, that she had actually struck a blow against the nightmare. But then the thing straightened, its head tilting slightly, and the mask cracked open, revealing what lay beneath. Claire recoiled in horror as the creature's face emerged from the torn flesh. A face like that of a child, twisted and warped, its skin stretched thin and translucent. The eyes were still dark voids, but now they were filled with something far worse, a deep, endless hunger. The creature reached for her again, faster than before, its claws now inches from her throat. But in that moment of pure terror, Claire's instincts took over. She pushed herself to her feet and bolted toward the far corner of the cell, her legs shaking beneath her as she ran. She wasn't thinking, wasn't planning. She just needed to get away. Her eyes locked onto a small crack in the wall, barely large enough to fit her body through, but it was her only chance. The creature snarled behind her, its footsteps heavy and relentless as it pursued her. It wasn't far behind. Claire's heart hammered in her chest, her body screaming for air, her muscles burning with the effort to escape. She reached the crack and squeezed her body through, her skin scraping against the rough stone. For a moment, she thought she might get stuck, but then, with one final push, she was through. On the other side of the crack, the hallway was narrow and dark, but it was a hallway, something that felt like an escape. She didn't care where it led. She just needed to keep moving. Behind her, she could hear the creature's shrill, feral screech, echoing off the walls, a chilling sound that made her blood run cold. It wasn't far behind. Claire didn't stop running. She didn't even look back. She had to keep going. The hallway twisted and turned, the walls narrowing with each step, but she pressed on, pushing her body beyond its limits. The air was thick and suffocating, but she could feel something else, something darker, lurking just out of sight, pulling at her, whispering to her. The whispers were back, but they weren't just coming from the shadows. They were coming from her own mind, filling her thoughts, clouding her judgment. Turn back. Stay with us. You belong here. The voices were insistent, urgent, their tone filled with a kind of cruel finality. Claire shook her head, trying to block them out. She couldn't stop now. She couldn't let the asylum claim her, couldn't let it drag her back into its twisted embrace. But as she rounded another corner, the hallway seemed to stretch out longer, the walls closing in around her. The light ahead, once a distant beacon of hope, now flickered, growing dimmer with each step. The floor beneath her feet shifted, uneven and unstable, and Claire realized with horror that she wasn't getting anywhere. The walls began to pulse, as if alive, and the whispers grew louder, their voices becoming one. She felt the weight of them, each one like a hand on her shoulder, pulling her back. The creature wasn't far behind now, and Claire's energy was fading. She couldn't outrun it forever. Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet gave way. The floor cracked open, sending her tumbling into the abyss once again. Claire's body plummeted into the blackness once again, a sensation of weightlessness overtaking her as the world seemed to dissolve into endless shadow. She could feel the coldness wrap around her, the darkness closing in as she fell deeper into the depths of the asylum. She had no idea how far down she was, nor how long she fell, but time lost all meaning in that moment. Then, with a sudden and violent jolt, her body slammed against something solid. Pain radiated through her limbs, and her breath left her in a strangled gasp as she collapsed to the ground. For a moment, everything was still. The fall had knocked the air out of her, and she lay there, gasping, struggling to make sense of what had just happened. Her body trembled from the shock, her heart racing in her chest. The room she had landed in was cold, eerily silent, and pitch black. There were no flickering lights here, no distant sounds of whispers or footsteps. It was as if the asylum had swallowed her whole, leaving her in a void, isolated from everything else. Claire pushed herself up onto her hands and knees, her head spinning, trying to adjust to the inky darkness surrounding her. Her breath came in shallow, uneven gasps as she slowly rose to her feet, her hands brushing the cold walls of the room, trying to ground herself in some reality. And then, the whispers returned, louder now, filling the void with their incessant, maddening chorus. But this time, they were different. They weren't just voices. They were words, distinct and clear, but spoken in a language Claire had never heard before. Leave, leave, leave. They hissed, over and over, each word dripping with malice, an inescapable command. She staggered backward, her mind racing. What were they? Was this another trick? A final attempt by the asylum to break her? Suddenly, a soft light flickered in the distance. It wasn't much, just a dim, trembling glow, but it seemed to beckon her. An invitation to leave the darkness, to escape the whispers, the maddening grip of the asylum that had been pulling her down ever since she'd entered. Claire, driven by a flicker of hope, started toward the light. With every step, the whispers grew more intense, more insistent, louder and louder, as if trying to drown her in their demands. But the light was closer now, and Claire pushed forward, ignoring the rising panic, ignoring the voices that tried to stop her. She reached the light, her hands outstretched, desperate for its warmth. And as her fingers brushed the source of the glow, the air around her seemed to shift. The whispers stopped. For a brief, fleeting moment, everything was silent. The darkness that had gripped her for so long seemed to release its hold, and Claire thought she might finally be free. But then, a figure appeared in the light. At first, it was just a shape, a shadow moving in the glow. But as it came into focus, Claire's stomach twisted with dread. It was a woman, tall, with long, flowing hair that shimmered even in the dim light. Her eyes, however, were empty, hollow voids that seemed to pierce Claire's very soul. The woman smiled, a cold, unsettling smile that sent a shiver down Claire's spine. Her lips parted, and the words she spoke were slow, deliberate. "You should have never come here." The words sent a chill through Claire's veins, but she couldn't turn away. Something about the woman's presence held her in place, like a force beyond her control. The woman's gaze was piercing, as if she could see through every thought, every fear Claire had ever experienced. "Welcome to the true depths of Ashford Asylum," the woman continued, her voice like the echo of a nightmare. "This is where they send those who will never leave." The words reverberated in Claire's chest, the finality of them sinking in. Ashford Asylum wasn't just a place. It was a prison for souls, for broken minds. And Claire had fallen deeper than she ever could have imagined. "No," Claire whispered, shaking her head. "No, I'm not like them. I'm not like the others." The woman's smile widened, but there was no kindness in it. "You think you can escape? You think you can leave? You're already here. You've always been here." With those words, the ground beneath Claire's feet seemed to shudder, the walls around her warping and stretching, as if the very building itself was alive. The light flickered violently, casting eerie shadows that danced and twisted like creatures hungry for her soul. Claire took a step back, her mind reeling. The woman's words echoed in her ears, and suddenly, it all made sense. The strange, shifting halls, the nightmarish creatures, the distorted faces of the patients, all of them trapped here. This place was more than just a hospital for the mentally ill. It was a place for the damned. But even as the woman's figure loomed before her, Claire couldn't give up. She had come too far. She had fought too hard. With renewed determination, Claire turned and sprinted away from the light, back into the darkness, the whispers following her like a shadow. She didn't know what awaited her in the abyss, but she had to try. She had to find a way out before it was too late. But as she ran, she felt something cold brush against her skin. Something sharp, something ancient. The walls began to close in around her, the air growing thicker, suffocating. And in the distance, just behind her, she could hear it. The sound of footsteps, slow and steady, but unmistakable. The woman was following her.